presentation. So here you can see the title Mini Masterclass 3 Ways to Implement Scaffolding Techniques Effectively, and you should still be able to see me as well in the little corner. Now, as I said, 3 things that I will discuss. What is scaffolding? Why is scaffolding important? And what are 3 ways to implement scaffolding in my lesson? Now, just, a technical thingy. If you are asking me questions while I'm doing the presentation, I can't see the chat. So please, I will occasionally go back to the chat and just see if there are any questions, but please don't be offended if I don't respond immediately. So during my presentation, I will just go back to the questions, to the chat every now and then. So what is a mini masterclass? Just so we are all on the same page. It's a short 20-minute lesson, and I said 20, but it should be between 20 and 30 because it's probably going to last longer. On a specific topic. I always want to involve practical lesson ideas, but I also want to teach you something about CLIL. I don't just want to give you 16 activities to try in your lesson tomorrow, and go and have fun. I really want you to understand something about CLIL as well while I explain things you can do in your lesson, trying to make this a win-win situation, both giving you something practical and also give you some knowledge. So that's what I aim for. Now, if you have any questions or remarks, make sure you type them in the chat. But as I said, I will have a look at that later on during the presentation a couple of times. Also, if you watch this at a later moment, just feel free to either type it in the chat if you watch this on Facebook, or if you watch this on YouTube, just respond in the comments below, and I will see if it needs to respond, I will obviously respond. Here we go, 3 ways to implement scaffolding techniques effectively. Let's delve into it now. Now let's start with talking about what is scaffolding. And I just wanted to give you 2 pictures, 2 different stages of scaffolding to give you an idea. On the left, you can see a scaffolding being constructed. So this is really the beginning. This is where there's no building just yet, where they start making the scaffold to start building the structure later on. And this is if you have learners who come in and don't really know anything about the language or the learning, and you need to help them with that. They have absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. So you start with getting the structure there, the scaffold, so that you can start constructing and helping them develop their language, develop their learning skills, develop their knowledge over time. Now on the right you can see, I think it's a church-like building with a bit of scaffolding around it. But a lot of scaffolding is already gone. If you go look at the roof, the scaffolding is gone. They already are taking some parts down, and that's actually what's happening when you get further on in the process of learners. You remove the scaffolding. They do not require all of your help anymore. So that's really what scaffolding in a classroom situation is about. You provide structure. You provide some ways to support them. That is different than providing them answers or providing them, ready to use things. Like, for example, word lists are a great way to help them, but it's not really scaffolding. Because then you just give them an answer. You say, okay, here you go, you have to use this. So you want to make sure that you keep an eye on that. And also, I'm already making the distinction between scaffolding learning and scaffolding language, but there's way more there's a lot more that you can scaffold and a lot more things you can do with this. But I'm not going to go into that too much today. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of scaffolding. So for example, let me show you how it works. If you have a task without scaffolding, it would look like read this text and answer the questions. Just do whatever you like, or not whatever you like, but do it in any way you like. Not really having any structure there. Just I assume you know what to do. Good, have fun. With scaffolding, there's a couple of ways you could do this. One way is identify the words you do not know, and we will discuss those in a minute. So you focus on the language. I'm not asking anything about the content. I'm not asking anything about questions. I'm first wanting to scan the text and just find some difficult words, and we will discuss those and see what those words actually mean, and the students can help each other, etc. Well, you know what to do next. You can also do this. First read the text and write down the 3 most important aspects of the text. So I'm not asking any questions just yet. I just want them to read it and then think about what do you think are the 3 most important aspects. So you see, this is not really a language-based scaffold. This is more of a learning-based scaffold because I want them to identify main parts. which is of course tricky to do. But it helps them to identify what are the most important parts of a text, because after you discuss this, you will be able to talk about, okay, so what do you think is the message of this text? And then afterwards you can actually ask them to answer questions. But then you already have provided them structure on what the text is about and what the most important elements are, etc. Another way to do this is write down what you already know about this topic, so the topic of the text, and come up with 3 questions you don't know the answer to yet. So again, you're not asking them to read the text, they just read a headline or maybe the first line. You do a short brainstorm on what do you think is the text about, and now what do you already know about this topic? And what 3 things, or 2 things, or 1 thing, it's really just an example, do you want to know about this topic that you don't know the answer to just yet? This triggers something of their imagination, but also their prior knowledge. It activates their prior knowledge, and they get a bit intrigued about what they are going to learn next. This is also scaffolding, because you're getting them into a learning mode. They get ready to make that next step, and using the questions and discussions, they can actually help each other create more knowledge on the topic before they actually start talking about the text. So these are just 3 ways that you can implement scaffolding when you discuss a text, and there's way more of this in the course, but this is just something that I want to show you now. Now, is it important? Now, this is an example of a building that when they built it, made some mistakes in the construction. They didn't really think some things through, and obviously it's not so much the scaffolding in reality, but more what they did wrong with the under the ground, the foundation. But one could argue that if you start building learning processes and language processes on a wrong foundation when it comes to learning, things will go sideways, just like the Tower of Pisa is in this picture. So yes, scaffolding is important, because if you do it without, you can end up with situations like this, and it's obviously quite impossible to put this back into its place. Once you are going in the wrong direction, you will have problems making sure that students are actually going into the direction of learning or language learning that you want them to. It's the same as when you have studied a certain phrase or a word, and students study that word and then start pronouncing it wrongly. Correcting that takes more energy than just teach them the correct way at first. Now, I already mentioned it before. If you do not use scaffolding, then students won't know what to do. It's that easy. If you just say, okay, do this and have fun, they will have faces like the girl over here and not really knowing what to do. Now, this can be because their learning is not on the same level as you want it to be, so you can't really assume they can already identify main topics if you've never introduced that specific phrase. But you can also have a language problem where students just don't know what the text is about, or don't know a lot of phrases or whatever. That's something that will obviously happen whenever you have a CLIL lesson and students' language level is lower than what the text or the authentic material level is. So that's why it's also important, not just because you have to build a strong foundation, but also because they otherwise simply don't know what to do. And I'm a mathematician, so I like structure, I like step-by-step plans, and you will see that later on when I share my lesson plans and lesson ideas. But this is something that I feel really strongly about, because it really fits my idea of how the education works. Sure, students can have a lot of freedom, and I do projects where they have a lot of freedom as well, but there are certainly a lot of moments in my lesson where the structure is really clear, the expectations are really clear, and they know precisely what to do. And of course, not doing something will result in consequences. I'm just going to go back to the chat and see if there's any questions so far. It doesn't seem to be any questions, so I'll just continue talking. I do see that more people are watching this. Great, thank you for joining. Just let me know if you have any questions in the chat, and I'll just be going back to my presentation. So if you want to know more about scaffolding, because I just really briefly touched on the topic right now, I just want to mention that scaffolding is one of the currently 5 courses available on CLIL Courses Online. I'm actually thinking about developing a 6th one, that's why it says currently. But if you want to have more information on the online courses that I offer, just go to this website, clilcoursesonline.com. Because I'm not going to talk about scaffolding too much right now, I just want to talk about the 3 applications that I wanted to introduce to you. Okay, here we go. the 3 activities that I want to discuss are homework presentations, answer the questions, and create your own assignment. Now, homework presentations is something that I do obviously to discuss homework, so it happens right at the beginning of a lesson. Answer the questions is a way to scaffold your instruction. Now, a lot of times instruction is just one way, so teachers talk, students listen, and I think there's a lot of ways you can, make sure it's more engaging than that, and this is just one way to do it, but it definitely involves scaffolding. And the third one is create your own assignment, where students have to make sure that they show that they apply their knowledge of a topic and they start creating problems for each other. Again, a lot of scaffolding is needed. So these 3 activities I will discuss, and I will show you examples from my own lessons. So you will see that the font and the way that the step-by-step plans work will be slightly different than the rest of the slides, simply because I copy and pasted it from my own lesson plans. So the things you're going to see are exactly the same thing that my students see whenever I give them the task. So let's start with the first one, homework presentations. Now, this is the instruction I give. So this is on screen when I do this activity. Discuss your homework with the people around you. Make sure you understand everything. Look in your book for explanations. Ask around or ask me. For 10 minutes, they have to discuss their homework and make sure they really understand it. I will mention, after 10 minutes, which homework problem I want to see presented. And then they get 1 more minute to think about how to present it. That's not enough time to really understand the topic or the question if they don't understand it. So they really should have done that 10 minutes early. And I don't understand is not an option anymore at this point, because they've had plenty of time to discuss it and ask questions. After that 1 minute, I will randomly select a student, and that student then has to present this problem in front of the class. And it says, remember 3 points to earn. That's the system I use for Class Dojo. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but this is something I do quite often in my lessons to make sure that homework discussions are more activated, if you will. Finished within 10 minutes, start with the homework. Why write that down? I will say that a bit more about that in a minute. Let's start with this. The first thing that I want to mention is that you see is 1, 2, 3, 4 here. I do this because I want to do this step by step. And it's also a great way to check for understanding. So I check, okay, do you now understand what you need to do? Are the steps clear? So if you're done with one, do you understand what you need to do next, etc. So these are just things that I want to do to provide structure to the task, but also to make sure they really understand what to do. So I can always ask afterwards, do you know what to do? No. Then why didn't you ask? Yes, then why aren't you doing it? That's because I asked beforehand, does everyone now understand what you need to do? And that's why I structure it like this. You see that there are language elements here. I want students to discuss things with each other, and I want them to present something. So that's why. So there's I definitely motivate a language output here. I want students to talk because that's the best way they learn a language. So these are 2 ways that in one activity that I use to motivate student output. Now, whenever students are going to present this in front of the class, if needed, I will provide them with some language scaffolds. So I will give them some example sentences they can use to actually think about how they're going to use it. I might even give them in step 3 already. So I tell them, okay, think about how you're going to present this. And here you have a list of possible sentences to use, just to give them an idea on how to do it. I can also make this, turn this around, especially when the language level is a little higher, and tell them, okay, you need to present this. And I want you to include at least 3 of these 6 words, forcing them to use maybe a little bit of a higher level language than they would normally use, because at some point you want their language level to rise. You want them to use more complicated words than the simple ones they start with when they start learning. So make sure that you use scaffolding to scaffold their language as well, but as I said, you can use it in 2 different ways. And one more thing, finish with 10 minutes, start with homework. As I said, that's something that I always write down. What can I do once you're done? Because it is also scaffolding learning, structuring what they need to do. And if they don't know what to do, for example, if they're done, they might actually start doing things you don't want them to. So making sure that the whole process, the learning process, has a beginning and an end, make sure that they know what to do once they're done. These are, by the way, always three things that I do. I check if they understand the task, I give them a time limit so they know when it's done, and I tell them what to do once they're done. So I always include these three things in every task that I give. I think that's an effective way of giving tasks. But again, not the topic of this masterclass. So let's just see how scaffolding is involved in this homework presentation activity. Now, as I said already, I provide step-by-step ideas, baby steps if needed. So I make them as small as possible so they can make that step and then feel more confident so they can make the next step. This is all about learning, so they know what to do next. I check if everyone knows what to do, and I allow some students some thinking time. This is something that we often forget in a CLIL or a language lesson. We might just ask a question and want an answer immediately, whereas students might have to think about it for a moment. And then we get impatient and we give someone else a turn, a student who does know the answer. So this is something you might want to pay attention to. And when you scaffold your activity like this, there's room for that. I'm not saying you have to do this every single time, but in this specific activity, I allow for student thinking time. As for scaffolding language, I motivate output, I already mentioned it, by providing example sentences, and I also scaffold their input by providing guidelines for words. Now here is my next activity, answer the questions. Again, this is the instruction they see on screen. Make sure you have the answer to these questions at the end of my instruction. What's the difference between the equation and inequality? What step is added to the steps of the balance method? When do you apply the step in an example? So the students see this before I start talking about the instruction, before I'm going to explain something. And depending on what room I'm in, really, whether or not I can project these questions and have a whiteboard still, or if I have to use the same screen, I will ask them to copy these questions. That depends, but they have to keep the questions available during my explanation. I don't want them to take notes, not when I do this, because sometimes they find it difficult to pay attention and take notes, and they don't know really what is the most important thing, what are the most important things, and what parts they don't need to copy. So this is an activity I use to scaffold their learning, scaffold their note-taking skills, and also make sure that they actually have in their notebooks the most important things of my instruction. So for example, as you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, again, step by step. So there's obviously a certain order in the way that I wanted to write this down. But these are actually also my lesson goals. At the end of my lesson, I want them to know the difference between equation and inequality. At the end of the lesson, I want them to know what step is added to the balance method. So these are just my lesson goals, but then rephrased as questions and then right there for students to see, so they immediately know what to do and what to expect. So this is also a great way to make lesson goals less of an abstract thing. I just apply it in my activity, then they know exactly what I ask of them and what they need to understand. And obviously, during my own explanation, I am forced to make sure that I answer these questions, so it also helps me focus. So this is what I meant. Yeah, focusing. I help them focus, both the students and myself, with these questions to make sure that they actually understand the topic of the lesson at the end of this lesson. And I can obviously go back to this as well. Also, if I now give them these questions, I can ask them, okay, do you see any words you don't know? Do you find any language challenges in these questions? Because then I can already make sure that I cover those before I start talking, so I don't get those questions during my explanation, and they might get distracted because they don't understand parts of what I'm talking about. Because I already give these questions beforehand, I scaffold their learning, but I also give some time to make sure their language is scaffolded. I make sure that their language elements are discussed, and I make sure that there is a good foundation, as I referring to the Tower of Pisa before I make that next step towards my explanation. Now, this is taking a long time to discuss, but obviously just giving them these questions takes like a minute in class, and then I move on. They don't have to know all the reasons why I do this. Now here you see equation and inequality, and also an exercise, an example, and I will talk about how do you say this. So this is 2x plus 5 smaller than 6x minus 11. What does that smaller than sign mean? Or I might even ask first, what does that symbol mean? you know. So, and I will also talk about them. Okay, so what is the difference between an equation and an inequality? So this way, I also make sure language is already activated. I discuss the language elements of these questions before I start actually talking about the content itself. So what elements in this activity were scaffolding? Now, I mentioned most of them already. It's step by step again. I make sure everyone understands the question by asking that. I again allow student thinking time. And I mention the language challenges that I actually might encounter when discussing a topic like this. The last one, create your own assignment. Again, this is my instruction for the students. So I ask them to choose a problem from a certain paragraph. I ask them to change the numbers of that specific problem, and they have to try and solve it themselves. And if they find that it's too difficult, they have to change numbers in a way so that they can actually solve it themselves. After they have solved it, they have to write down the problem on a separate piece of paper, including their name, and have to hand it in. And then I will redistribute that, and they get someone else's problem. Have to do it and check it with someone else. Just gonna check if there's any questions so far in the Facebook group. Nope, no questions. Good. Moving on. So let's just talk about this first. Obviously, this is a really specific example. I mentioned paragraphs. I mentioned change the numbers. I actually do this in a variety of ways. Sometimes I tell them choose something from this paragraph only. Sometimes I even scaffold it a bit more. Then I give them an example problem and I tell them to change numbers from numbers ranging from -10 to 10 or something. So I really limit the amount of options there. For example, if I explain how negative numbers and adding up negative numbers work, then it's really about filling in random numbers and then see if they understand it. But you can also, if you do this with other subjects, ask, can you come up with your own questions about this text, for example? So you have a text over here, what questions can you ask about this? Now, asking students to solve it themselves, something they created, make sure that it's not too difficult, because they might be annoying little kids who just make a really difficult assignment for someone else. By forcing them to first solve it themselves, I make sure that doesn't happen. But it also allows students to make a problem on a level they see fit for themselves. So sometimes they will just make an easy one, but especially when I ask them, okay, try to make something challenging, they will make more difficult ones because they want to challenge themselves, but also someone else. It's their chance right now to actually, get someone else to do something they created they created for someone else. So that's something they're really motivated to do. And I do this activity quite a lot. And I've never had students who had motivation problems doing this. And of course, when they get a problem from someone else, they have to speak. They have to discuss this. And again, we are motivating spoken output because they have to check, okay, why is this correct? Why is this wrong? And when they have different answers, then they have to discuss what happened, why did it go wrong, etc. Oh yes, I wanted to mention one more thing with the previous arrow. There's not really cheating going on. You can't really cheat because they have to check it with each other. So it makes them more aware of their own learning process, but also makes them accountable, because they have to discuss it with someone else, and that they have to be open to suggestions. So being held accountable is something I find very important. If a student doesn't do what I want them to do, they have to feel the consequences for that. And this is obviously not me forcing them to do something or with a grade or anything, but them having to tell someone else, I didn't do what I needed to do, and that other person can't do something then. That makes them a lot more aware of their own responsibility in class. So the person who created the problem, as I said, that language element there is all about having students being motivated to speak with each other. Just as a potential follow-up for this, this is something you can do in your lesson, but I also sometimes do this at the end of my lesson, and then students have to hand in those papers, and I redistribute them at the beginning of the next lesson. So then it's more of a nice opener for the next lesson, something I didn't have to do anything for. Students created all of these themselves. So these are the 3 activities that I wanted to share with you, and all of these can be done without any preparation. I'm assuming you know your lesson goals already, of course, but the activity themselves, all of them, do not require any preparation. You can just use them in your lesson immediately, and I hope I clarified how scaffolding is involved in all of these activities. So I discussed what is scaffolding, I discussed why is scaffolding important, and I gave you 3 ways to implement this in your lesson right now without any preparation. Now please share in the chat on Facebook or in the comments below on YouTube if you have any questions or follow-up requests. Maybe you want to maybe you have a specific question about something I discussed in this mini masterclass, or maybe you want me to discuss other topics related to this or unrelated to this. Feel free to share that below. I will have a look at it whenever needed, and who knows, maybe I'll just choose one of your topics and you do a mini masterclass about that next time. Now I try to do a mini masterclass every month, but that depends a bit on my planning, because as a teacher I also have other things to do. I'm afraid checking tests is something that we still have to do as teachers, and it takes a whole bunch of time as well. Now if you want to learn more about CLIL, you might know that I actually created online courses about CLIL, and scaffolding is just one topic. I created 5 courses on this, and scaffolding is what we discussed in this specific mini masterclass, is just a very small part of what scaffolding is all about, and all of these courses you can access online on clilcoursesonline.com, so feel free to go there if you want to discover more about CLIL, and if you want some more help from me. I look forward to seeing you next time, and if you have any questions, make sure you mention them in the chat. See you around.